Hi everyone. Before we start this episode, we've got a little favour to ask you. We'd love to hear a bit more about you and what you think of the Conversation Weekly. So we launched a listener survey. It should just take a few minutes of your time and we'd really appreciate it if you could fill it out. To do so, please click on the link in our show notes or on the link in the article associated with this podcast on The Conversation if you're listening via our website. Okay, now on with the show. As the results of an exit poll for the UK general election flashed up on the front of the BBC's Broadcasting House in London at 10 p.m. on the 4th of July, there were loud cheers from a group of people gathered in the street below. When all the votes were counted, Labour had won a landslide victory, ending 14 years of Conservative rule in the UK. The next day, the Labour Party leader, Keir Starmer, walked into Downing Street as the country's new Prime Minister.
Good afternoon. I have just returned from Buckingham Palace, where I accepted an invitation from His Majesty the King to form the next government of this great nation.
In France, a few days later on the 7th of July, supporters of the far-left party La France Insoumise had gathered at 8 p.m. at Place Stalingrad in the northeast of Paris. Expecting that the far-right Rassemblement National, the National Rally, would emerge with a majority, they erupted in cheers as the exit poll was announced. It was actually a left-wing coalition called the Nouveau Front Populaire, which came out on top with most seats.
Because of the Republican Front, which is an alliance between Macron's camp and the New Leftist Alliance, this changed the election.
No party won a majority in the French elections. The Rassemblement National, which was formerly the Front National and is now led by Marine Le Pen and her protégé Jordan Bardella, were pushed back into third place, behind President Emmanuel Macron's Ensemble coalition. It remains a fluid political situation, and it's still unclear who will become Prime Minister. In a different type of episode this week, we brought together two political experts, one from each country, to help us analyse the results and what they tell us about the right in France and the UK. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Joining me to discuss the results of the recent French and British elections are Tim Bale, Professor of Politics at Queen Mary University of London. Tim has published widely on British politics and published a book last year called The Conservative Party After Brexit, Turmoil and Transformation. Hi Tim, thanks for joining us.
Hi there, happy to be here.
And from France, we're joined by Safia Dahani, postdoctoral researcher in sociology at the Université Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne. Safia is an expert on the far right in France and recently co-edited a book called The Political Sociology of the Rassemblement National. Bonjour Safia, thank you for being with us.
Hi, thank you for the invitation.
So we're speaking on the 9th of July, just 2 days after the French elections and 5 days after the UK ones. Tim, let's go to you first. How would you summarise the political mood in the UK right now in just a couple of words or phrases?
Well, I guess right now you would say for many people it's relief. I think there was a very strong anti-Tory mood. There was a very strong desire to get rid of the government. That's been achieved. But I think there is a degree of concern that the challenges facing the Starmer government are pretty enormous, and also some concern that, of course, it won its landslide victory on a fairly low share of the vote.
And Safia, what about you? Same question about France. How would you summarise the political mood right now?
I think it's really hard to sum up in a few words, but I would say that the French political life is both polarized and unprecedented because since the last Sunday, there are probably three political forces that are represented in the National Assembly without any of them having gained the majority of the seats.
Would you use the word relief in the same way Tim just did?
Well, I think for people from the left and for Macron's majority, ex-majority, it's kind of a relief because the far right didn't win the majority of the seats. But I don't think it's like a defeat of the far right, which is now the third force represented in the National Assembly.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the UK election. It did happen a few days before the French one. So, Tim, the UK perhaps has a reputation internationally for being a bit conservative, stiff upper lip, all that, monarchy loving, and more recently anti-immigrant, anti-European. It did, after all, vote to leave the EU by a majority of 53% in 2016. But A Labour government under Keir Starmer has just won this landslide victory. So why has the UK turned to the left?
Well, I mean, I think it's very much an anti-incumbency vote, it has to be said. Clearly, some of the fundamentals, I think, were working against the government, and to some extent also they're the authors of their own misfortune. I think we have to go back to austerity in 2010 to 2015. That meant that the UK economy was growing very, very slowly. I mean, people's real wages have barely recovered, really, from the global financial crisis, and that was a very long time ago. It's also the case, obviously, that austerity to some extent crippled public services, which most people rely on, and in particular the National Health Service was really beginning to show the strains of the lack of resources, huge waiting lists, long time to see GP, long time to wait in accident and emergency. So those two fundamentals I think were pretty important. Brexit obviously made a difference as well. It upended the Conservative Party so that it cycled through 5 prime ministers in 8 years, and many of the people that it picked as leaders turned out to be fairly unsuitable for all sorts of reasons. So I think, Brexit has to be held to some extent responsible. And also, I think when you look at the promises made by the advocates of Brexit, they just weren't delivered really, both in terms of, the money going to public services that supposedly would be diverted from Brussels. That didn't really happen. Levelling up didn't really happen. And of course, most of all, perhaps for those who voted for it anyway, the promises on taking back control of our borders didn't deliver lower immigration. And, for many supporters of Brexit, that was absolutely key. So many people felt betrayed by that. And I think when you put all those things together, the result to some extent was a foregone conclusion.
As you've said, much of this is about the Conservatives losing this election rather than Labour perhaps winning it. And that was kind of one of the stories of the night. They went from having a large majority when Parliament was dissolved in May to their lowest number of seats in history. And they won 24% of the overall vote as a party. You've written a book about the turmoil in the party. So can you give us a bit more detail about what that turmoil meant for this result, how it led to this result?
Well, I think there are several aspects. One is the complete breakdown of discipline and deference within the Conservative Party that I think had a lot to do with Brexit. Clearly, we've had Tory rebellions before on particular issues, and obviously John Major found it very difficult in the 1990s over Europe. But I think both in the lead up to the referendum and then after the referendum, the party to some extent fell apart. It was picked up by various leaders at various points, and it looked like it might be able to transcend some of the turmoil that we've seen. But it almost defaulted back to chaos after a few months. And that's what happened clearly under Theresa May. It happened under Boris Johnson, happened very quickly under Liz Truss, and it happened also to a slightly lesser extent, but still an extent, under Rishi Sunak. So I think that was important. I think when people vote, they want to feel that there is a government there that is in control and a prime minister who is in control of his or her party. And I think the Conservative Party wasn't able to argue that. I think also, and in some ways this is the kind of main argument of the book, that the Conservative Party became so obsessed, if you like, with both Brexit and then being able to suppress the support for the populist radical right under Nigel Farage, that it risked turning itself into a populist radical right party, or an ersatz version thereof, with the result that it started using the language of the populist right and also obviously adopting some of the measures of the populist radical right, which had two effects. One, it actually put off a lot of voters who otherwise would have voted for the Conservative Party and had previously done. And many of those flipped over to the Liberal Democrats or Labour as a result, because they just couldn't stomach the kind of language that was coming out from Conservative politicians. And two, I'm afraid all it did, and I think this is what happens in Europe as well, is simply up the salience of those kinds of issues. And actually advantaged in the end the populist radical right itself, because so many voters who are tempted that way prefer the original to the copy, if you like.
Yeah, because the swing to Reform UK that the right-wing party led by Nigel Farage at this election was another kind of big thing that emerged from election night. They came second in 103 constituencies and won 14% of the vote overall. What do we know that's emerging about who these reform voters are and really how big a political force they are already and could become?
Well, they're not really so very different from the kind of people who have voted reform for quite some time, really. They tend to be older. They tend to be socially very conservative. They're quite uncomfortable with the cultural changes that immigration has brought over the years. Many of them will have left school quite early, so they're not particularly well educated. They're not necessarily left behind in the sense of being particularly deprived. Many of them are actually quite comfortably off. Many of them live in places which previously were pretty homogeneously white, but have recently been affected, or as they would put it, afflicted by changes brought about by immigration. Many of them are concentrated in the kind of the east of England. There is a degree of concentration for support for Reform UK. But that then moves us on to the second part of your question, which is under first past the post. It remains the case that if your support is relatively thinly spread, and despite what I've said about some concentration in East England, that is the case for Reform UK, you simply can't convert the amount of support you've got in terms of vote share into seat share, which is why, as we've already pointed out, they won 14% of the vote, but only got 5 MPs. Clearly they did come second, as you pointed out, in many constituencies, and they will be hoping to leverage that perhaps into more first places next time around. But what we do know is the majority of the votes came from the Conservative Party and didn't really come from the Labour Party. And while Nigel Farage has talked a good game after the election, about we're coming for Labour, actually, it doesn't seem to me that there is a great deal of potential for reform to take votes off people who voted Labour in 2024. And if you look at some of the polling, for example, done by Lord Ashcroft after the election, asking people what was the most important issue for them when they voted, well, Reform voters, 60% of them said it was immigration. For Labour voters, only 2%, TWO, said immigration. So it doesn't seem to me that there is a great deal of potential for Reform to snatch voters from Labour. There may be some more potential for them to snatch voters from the Conservatives, of course.
So, Tim, who do you think will define what happens next to the right in the UK?
Well, of course, Nigel Farage will be extremely important, but so too will be whoever the Conservative Party chooses as its new leader, because that person is going to have to decide how they handle Nigel Farage. Are they going to maintain this red line between the Conservatives and Reform UK, or are they going to try and absorb Reform UK, either formally or informally? Are they going to invite Nigel Farage perhaps in the end to join the Conservative Party? Is he going to make moves to do that? He wants to engineer some kind of reverse takeover of the Conservative Party. I think that's quite unlikely. But I do think that if whoever they elect doesn't gain much traction against the Labour government, and some Conservatives do decide in the end that Nigel Farage ought to be in the Conservative Party itself, then Nigel Farage has got a reasonably good chance of one day becoming Conservative Party leader. I'm not predicting that will take place. I think it's probably on the unlikely side of things that may happen in the future, but I wouldn't completely rule it out.
Safia, when Tim was describing who the voters were for the Reform Party in the UK, did you hear any similarities between the Rassemblement National in France, or do you think they are really very different beasts?
Well, no, what was said was kind of similar of what we know about the National Rally's voters. I mean, there are scientific work on those electorates since the 1980s. And what we know is that on the one hand, different fractions of social classes will vote for the far right in France, from the very rich to the very poor. And on the other hand, what characterizes these different electorates is the centrality of the questions linked to differences between populations. To say it differently, those electorates kind of believe that the National Rally's program around racism, xenophobia, sexism, homophobia is kind of a good thing for their everyday life and for France. It's not just a protest vote. it's also a vote of conviction of people who subscribe to this differentialist worldview, racism, difference between good French people and bad French people, difference between good immigrants and bad immigrants, and they kind of think that immigration is a real danger for the so-called national French identity, which is like reconstituted and that don't exist. But what I would like to point out is that in France, for like 2 decades, the National Front has tried to present itself really differently and try to distance itself from the far right and what we think of the far right. And I think that some of the media and some of other political parties have contributed to make it what it seems to be today, a normal party and a party like any others. In some of the media, for example, they stopped calling it a far-right party, and they preferred to say that it was a populist or radical right party. I think that we can say that different European parties are from the far right, even though they don't have historical roots during the Second World War, and in France, for example, it's the Vichy regime. And I also think that when we say that they are not far-right because they commit to democracy and that they participate in election, it's kind of the whole point of the National Front, which was created in 1972 in order to be present in the electoral campaigns.
Safia, let's turn to the French election results, because these results of the second round of the parliamentary elections came as quite a shock. Instead of emerging with a majority, either relative or absolute, the Rassemblement National and its allies were pushed actually into third place in terms of number of seats. Although the party did win 33% of the overall vote, and I think is still the largest single party in the National Assembly, if you take away the coalitions. So from what you're hearing in the last 24 hours or so since the vote, what's been the reaction from within the party to the results and their own analysis of what's happened?
Well, first of all, I think we must remember the role that played the pollsters, who really misled us during all the legislative process, suggesting that the far right could win an absolute majority by lying itself. And I think we need to point that out too, with the right, because they were not alone in this election. Last night and 2 days ago, Jordan Bardella gave speeches in the media, trying to create a narrative around this relative failure. First, I think there is a kind of mea culpa narrative which is being put in place. And according to Jordan Bardella, what they see as a failure in this election is linked to different candidates who were described as problematic. And the second point is that they insist on the role played by the Republican Front, which means the mobilization of the voters from the left, from the center, and from the right against their candidates during the second round, describing it as and I quote, an unholy alliance between the presidents, Macron, and the far left, the extreme far left. But I think we need to talk more about the way they try to explain their failure around different candidates. And they were saying that there were different candidates that were problematic because they didn't know the program, they didn't know how to talk to journalists, and also they had publicly anti-Semitic, racist, xenophobic, sexist, and homophobic positions that usually are trying to be hidden by the party. And I think that a lot of the media were surprised to find those candidates in the National Front. But from a politist point of view, I think it's surprising that the media were surprised. And so I don't think that it's a valid explanation to understand why they came out third in the results. And I think we need to call into questions the way journalists and some of my colleagues try to analyze this party, saying that it was like any others. But I think the last election showed that it's not like any others. It's a far-right party with far-right candidates, and also with people that don't really know how to do professional politics. But if they say that it's kind of a failure, I think from my point of view, it's not really a failure. They gain more seats that they had in 2022. They are the kind of third force represented in the National Assembly. It means that they are here and they are settling in the French political life. But even though there were less candidates of the National Front that won the seats in the second round, when you think about the way the parties gain money after each elections, is the first round of the legislative that kind of counts. Yeah, you have financial help from the state regarding the number of votes you have on the first round of the legislative this election. So even though you don't gain a lot of the seats, you still have a lot of money from the millions of people that vote for you in the first round. And then the second part of the public financial help for political parties is linked to the number of candidates that are elected.
There's a very interesting parallel there, actually, in terms of what you said about the media discovering candidates, because that's exactly what happened during the general election with Reform in the UK. All sorts of candidates were identified by the media as having quite extreme views and having said all sorts of weird and not very wonderful things on Facebook, on Twitter over the years. And indeed, Reform actually dropped a few of the candidates after, some of the stuff that they had previously said was revealed. So I think, these parties generally, whether they can be classified as extreme or whether they can be classified simply as populist radical right, often attract people who have very, very extreme views. But, certainly in the UK, know that, any party that perhaps properly reflects their views has no chance at an election, and therefore tend to gravitate towards Reform UK as an alternative perhaps to more extreme outfits.
The narrative of the second round, Safia, in France is that France has shifted to the left. That's kind of what people are saying. But as you said, the Rassemblement National did really well. It's got more seats. So tell us about how the far right has become more and more integrated in French society. They have this strategy called de-diabolisation, and it seems to have worked, I guess, if 33% of French voters voted for them. So what, in your research, has been the most successful parts of that strategy?
So, the Front National is working on its public image and is trying to propose ways to make itself less extreme and to influence the framing around its organization. The diabolisation, in fact, refers to forms of political and journalistic validation of this strategy in television, in the press, and in other political parties, mainly from the right and a bit from the center, that have considered during the last 10 or 20 years the Front National that had changed and was normalized, in fact helping to trivialize it and to make it appear maybe less extreme. And I can take two examples to illustrate my points. For example, during the presidential campaign in 2022, Valérie Pécresse was the candidate of the right-wing party Les Républicains, spoke during many meetings about the Grand Remplacement, the Great Replacement, which is a far-right conspiracy theory, a main topic of the far-right, the idea that immigrants are replacing French population, white people. So it was really surprising that a candidate of the right party was talking like the far-right. And recently, in French politics, Emmanuel Macron's government proposed a law about immigration that included in the text the national preference, which is a proposition to first give jobs to French people. It's the main proposition from the National Rally since Jean-Marie Le Pen, so since the 1980s, but Macron included it in its law. So I think that other political parties recently have been talking like the National Front, have been taking their propositions into account, and I think this has created a kind of illusion that the National Front is a party like any others.
Do you ever get that unsettling feeling that something's wrong with society?
Inequality? Because our country has no spirit. Political dysfunction.
That our body politic is, well, rather unwell? In What's Wrong with Democracy, a podcast brought to you by Tortoise and supported by the Open Society Foundations. Each week, we will surgically investigate democracy's strengths and weaknesses, its parasites and pathologies. The first episode is available to listen to now, wherever you get your podcasts.
I want to focus a bit more on immigration because it's come up in both of your analyses of what's happened in recent days. So, Tim, what do you think the huge majority for Labour says about the immigration debate in the UK now? And can Labour turn the conversation on immigration into something more positive rather than focusing on small boats, borders, and the people who are coming and making that dangerous journey across the Channel?
The majority of the population in the UK would still like to see immigration go down. And that's true, at least of a plurality of Labour voters, actually. So there's no sense in which Labour winning the election, I think, makes a very big difference to that. I think Obviously, the first, as it were, change that Labour has made on day one, actually, is to declare the Rwanda scheme dead.
This is a scheme where the Conservative government under Rishi Sunak planned to send migrants and asylum seekers to Rwanda. If you scroll back through your feed for the Conversation Weekly, you'll find an episode that we did about this just a few weeks ago.
The Rwanda scheme was dead and buried before it started. It's never been a deterrent, and I'm not prepared to continue with gimmicks.
But I don't think there was much risk in them doing that, because there was very little confidence in the UK population, even among those who supported the idea in principle, that it was workable or indeed value for money. So I think that's a fairly kind of risk-free hit, as it were, for the Labour government. I think most people would argue that there are more sensible ways of stopping the boats than Rwanda. And, you know, the government's move towards sort of intelligence-led policing, more cooperation with the French and other European authorities seem to be sensible, I think, to most people, as do their plans to speed up the processing of asylum seeking. But then, of course, we get to this thorny question of what you do for people whose applications are turned down and cannot be returned. That is still going to be a problem for Labour. And certainly, you know, as the summer progresses and we see more and more people come across the channel, that's going to be the Labour government's problem, just as it was the Conservative government's problem. I would say, however, that Labour will probably be punished a little bit less, partly because they've just promised a lot less on this particular issue. I think, you know, Rishi Sunak's problem in part was because he made this ridiculous promise to stop the boats completely that was never going to be fulfilled. I think obviously Nigel Farage in Parliament will be pressing, you know, on immigration. But all the parties, obviously the responsible parties, need to start reframing immigration so that it's not seen in terms of a problem that can be solved somehow, but just a phenomenon that needs to be managed. And I think until they persuade people of that fact, then, you know, we're going to be in trouble.
Mm. And Safia, the Rassemblement National also focused a lot in their campaign on controlling immigration. You mentioned their proposals to block some dual citizens from certain public jobs. They also proposed removing the droit du sol, which means anybody born on French soil to a parent also born on French soil is automatically a French citizen. But some in the party have already, in the last few days, started blaming this dual citizenship policy for the defeat. I wonder how much influence you think those kind of policies on immigration actually had for their result. What do you think the party will do in response?
I don't really know what they will do, but what we can say, there have been a shift on immigration policies around, like, it's positive, we need people to come, we need people to work because we don't have the workforce. Two, immigration is a danger for France, it's a danger for our national identity, it's a danger for white people and stuff like this. My second point is that there is in everyday life a lot of polls around immigration and around insecurity. And we need to understand the difference between the feeling of insecurity and actually what happens around insecurity in France. And far-right electorate is not only a protest vote, it's also a vote of conviction of people who think that immigration means dangerous people, mean insecurity in the streets, mean sometimes the increase of rape. So the framing of the far right around immigration has always been that it is a danger. They really focus on immigration that is not white, that is poor, that is linked to Muslim religion sometime. And I think it's at their core since they created the party in 1972. I think it is still at the core of their party today. It's still at the core of why people are voting for them. But what happened in France is that a lot of other political parties try to frame immigration like the far right was framing it. For example, the right during the Sarkozy presidency had a Ministry of Immigration and National Identity. They were trying to talk to the far right voters by saying things that the National Front could say. So I think there is like a general framing around the danger of immigration, and I think it's giving the National Front fuel to keep going around the framing of immigration as a problem.
I want to just spend a couple of minutes talking about the voting system itself in both countries, because Tim, in the UK, Labour won 412 seats, so that's 63% of the total of the UK Parliament, but it only got 34% of the overall vote. So you've argued that the dominance of the two main parties relies on this continued commitment to first past the post. But is the UK's voting system therefore not really fit for purpose anymore?
Well, I would argue personally that it isn't. I think we've had a multi-party system for quite some time, but we have an electoral system that ideally suits two-party politics, which we don't really have anymore. The question is whether, we ought to change the electoral system in order to fit the party system. But there will be considerable resistance to that for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, is that the Labour Party have gained a system extremely effectively. And since they are in power, they are the ones who have the opportunity or otherwise to change the electoral system. Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, etc., etc. So that's not going to happen. The other reason, of course, and, it will be put forward by progressives who might otherwise be expected to support a reform like this, is that it actually prevents Reform UK and Nigel Farage from gaining, 70, 80 seats in the parliament. And therefore, one of the advantages of first past the post is it does squeeze down the vote for what they would regard as extremists. So I think the Conservative Party's attitude will be very interesting to watch. I mean, historically, obviously, as a beneficiary of first past the post, it's been very keen to keep that system. I expect that will still be the case. But you can make actually an argument that it would be in the Conservative Party's interests in the end to adopt proportional representation, because at the moment they face a situation where the vote for the right is split. They don't get as many seats as perhaps they should in Parliament, but that is certainly the case for Reform UK. If we change the electoral system, then the Conservative Party would be in a situation where it could, if needs be, rely on Reform UK, either as a coalition partner or indeed as a party that could support it from the outside, and therefore enable the Conservative Party to form a government where, under first past the post, it might not be able to. Now, I think that's a pretty persuasive argument if I were a Conservative, but I doubt it's one that will actually get much traction because they are so wedded to the existing system.
And Safia, there's a similar dynamic going on in France. It's perhaps not so pronounced as it is in the UK, but the Rassemblement National got 33% of the vote and won just under 25% of the seats. And also, there's a real sense that tactical voting is kind of baked into the French political system, particularly when you have these second rounds where you have this ability for a barrage, a kind of block against, in this case, the far right. And actually more than 220 third place candidates withdrew in the second round, so that the far right only had one candidate against them in each case. What questions are being raised now in France around the system, around democratic choice, and how representative the system really is of people's political family, I guess?
Well, I think that there have been some political people from the far right to the left that are trying to frame the return of proportional voting for the legislative elections. As a reminder, this proportional vote has already been implemented once in 1986 for legislative elections. And in 1986, it was the first time that the National Front was able to form a parliamentary group in the National Assembly. But they are trying to put on the agenda that proportional voting would be more interesting to represent more the electorates. But I don't know what is going to happen.
So France is now heading into this big period of political uncertainty. We don't know who's going to emerge as prime minister, and it's probable that Emmanuel Macron will have a prime minister who's not from his own governing party. And under French law, there can't be another election for a year, so there will have to be some kind of arrangement. But what do you think this all means for the Rassemblement National, Safia? Did you think it means that we're more likely or less likely to see Marine Le Pen winning in 2027 when we have the next presidential elections in France? Could it be that the party pushes even further to the right or to the centre? Is it clear yet what might happen?
To understand 2027, what I can point out is that the the day, like yesterday, the day after the legislative results, posters were already trying to understand what will happen, and they are already saying that if Marine Le Pen presents herself at the presidential election, she might be first on the first round with more of 30% of the electorate. But I think that those polls don't really make any sense, since they take place 3 years before the presidential election, since during those next years the National Assembly can be dissolved once again. So I don't know what will happen in 2027, but I think we need to understand that the legislative election gave more power to the National Front. They have more elective representative in the National Assembly. They are going to gain millions and millions of euros of financial state help to fund the party. So, like, they are more powerful today than they were before.
And Tim, there have been some comparisons made, I think, on both sides of the channel on the period that France is about to enter, this political uncertainty, perhaps chaos even, and what happened in the UK post-Brexit. And I think some prominent political figures in France actually evoked the post-Brexit moment in UK, using it to warn voters against voting for the Rassemblement National. Are there any lessons that you could point to from this years of post-Brexit chaos in the UK that French politicians might do well to heed?
Well, I think the last thing that French politicians or French people in general want to hear is a lecture from an Englishman or indeed English people in general. I mean, actually, what I find interesting in some ways is the reverse of the question, which is what happened in France got to teach the Conservative Party in Britain. And I think some of the things that Safia has said actually are quite useful in this respect, in the sense that we often make parallels between the Conservative Party in the UK and the Republicans in the United States of America, and say if it's not careful, the Conservative Party will go the way of the Republicans. It will become dominated by MAGA or the equivalent thereof. In the UK, there will be some sort of insurgency into the Conservative Party, maybe by Nigel Farage and Reform, which will see the Conservative Party totally transformed and no longer become a centre-right party, but a full-blown populist radical right party. And I think in some ways what's happened to Les Républicains in France actually suggests that the stronger parallel is with France rather than the United States of America, in the sense that there you had a party, okay, it had a slightly different name under Sarkozy, but Sarkozy was in some ways the beginning of this trend. You have a party which became so concerned about soaking up or picking up voters from the far right that it began to echo much of the language and indeed some of the measures suggested by the far right, thinking that would help it in the long run. But in the long run, it hasn't helped it at all. Les Républicains have just got smaller and smaller, despite the fact that, as Safia suggested, on occasion they have talked like the Rassemblement and sounded very much like the far right. And it's done them absolutely no good at all. And I would suggest actually that Conservative politicians should look at what happened to their centre-right counterparts in France and be very, very careful that they don't go the same way.
Safia, you were nodding through that.
Yeah, well, yeah. When we study, for example, the way the National Front gain electorates, I think we cannot understand the way French far right has evolved and gained more and more support without understanding how it could take away some electorates from the Républicains. And even though when you look at the European level, we also say that far right cannot gain the power without the help of the right. And in France, like Éric Ciotti, the former president of Les Républicains, left its party to join the far right. He left with several candidates. So, yeah, the far right is helped by the right and by conservative parties in order to gain power.
Well, thank you both so much for spending some time with us and analysing these very new votes. And I know you will be both doing a lot more work on them in the future. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Safia.
Thank you.
And thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of The Conversation Weekly. A big thanks to Claire Chakravarti at The Conversation in France and to Laura Hood at The Conversation in the UK for their help with this episode. You can find links to The Conversation's ongoing analysis of the UK and French elections and their aftermaths in our show notes. This episode was produced by Mend Marawani, sound design was by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and I'm Gemma Ware, the show's executive producer. You can connect with us on Instagram at theconversation.com or email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. If you like what we do, please support our podcast and The Conversation more broadly by going to donate.theconversation.com, and please rate and review the show wherever you listen, as it really helps us reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.